Welcome to video 4 of Module 1, Chapter 1. We just finished talking about residency, talking about those primary and secondary ties that for someone who wants to come to Canada or leave. Do we want to create those ties to become residents, and we want to break those ties when we don't want to be residents anymore? This video is going to be talking about deemed residents. So deemed residents are people who might not normally be considered residents of Canada. They don't have primary ties, but due to legal purposes, they are deemed to be residents. So if they are deemed to be a resident, they are taxed on their worldwide income for the entire tax year. When we used the ties for residency, we had a break of the date they became or stopped being resident. But if someone's deemed a resident, they are hit for the entire year. The thing about deemed residents is many of them don't physically live in Canada. So if they don't live here, then they're not factual residents of a province or territory. So I mentioned in a previous video that you're taxed a federal rate and a provincial rate. But since a provincial rate won't apply, deemed residents will pay an additional federal tax equal to 48% of the basic tax rate. This is supposed to account for the amounts that would have been the provincial rate. So it says 48% or about half. So if your federal rate's about 15%, then they might add an additional 7.5% to make up that provincial rate that you're not applying. Yes. So the first kind of deemed resident is a sojourner. A sojourner is someone who stays in a place for a period of time. So let's say someone doesn't live in Canada, but they love being in Canada and they take trips through the mountains in British Columbia. They like to take road trips across Saskatchewan and see the prairies. They often come, they are spending many days in Canada. If an individual is a factual resident of another country, but has been in Canada for 183 cumulative days, then they are a deemed resident. So they establish a temporary resident and includes vacation trips to Canada. If they come to Canada even for a part day, it's included a full day. So maybe they're coming into Canada like in the morning, they leave at night and sleep at home. They're still in Canada, so they'll be counted as a full day. If you're commuting for work, then they're not counting the days. That's how someone can live in Washington and work in Canada and still be a non-resident, because if you're coming for work and you go home right after work, then it's not counted. It's mostly looking for those people who are opting to come into Canadian territory. So 183 is just over half a year. 183 is half of 366. So if you spend more than half the year in Canada, you are a sojourner. Now, these days don't have to be in a row. You don't have to stay for 6 months to be a sojourner. You can come for 2 weeks on, 2 weeks at home, 2 weeks in Canada, or every other day you're in Canada. As long as your cumulative days add up to 183 or more, then you are a sojourner. Members at any time during the year of Canadian Armed Forces when stationed outside of Canada. This is the second type of deemed resident. And you'll notice the theme in the next few items is if you are a soldier of Canada, you may be stationed overseas. Maybe you work as part of the army doing aid in the Ukraine's going through a conflict. So you've been in the Ukraine all year. You are there as an employee and or a representative of Canada. So even though you're not here, you are still a resident. Your reason for being outside the country is to fulfill your duties to Canada. So if you're in the armed forces, or if you are an ambassador, a minister, a high commissioner, if you're an individual performing services at any time in a country under a prescribed international development assistance program for Canada. So if you are elsewhere in the world doing your job for Canada, you are a deemed resident. Perhaps, so let's say I move to France because I'm going to be an ambassador of France, so I bring my family with me. I'm working for Canada, so I'm a deemed resident. My family will also be considered deemed residents because they're in France for me. I'm working as a representative of Canada, and they are here because they're my family. So, children of a deemed resident who are also dependent and whose income was less than the basic personal amount, which is 16,000, will be a deemed resident, basically saying if the child lives with me and relies on me, then they are a deemed resident because I am. But let's say my child is 18 and they move out of my house, they're still living in France and they're making their own income. Well, now they are a resident of France. They're all, despite their reason for being there for my job, they've now established a life. They have their own ties to the country. So an individual who at any time of the year was under an agreement or a convention with another country, whether part of a tax treaty, entitled to an exemption from income tax otherwise payable because at that time the person was related to an individual resident of Canada. That is a lot of words to say. Perhaps your job is not for Canada, but as long as your actions are on behalf of Canada, or if the tax treaty between the two countries give precedence to Canadian tax rule, then you might still be considered a deemed resident. Remember, tax treaties override Tax Act clauses. So that's how it functions. If you're in Canada a lot, or if you're representing Canada around the world or working for them, or if you're related to someone performing those responsibilities, you're generally considered a deemed resident. So, Miss Blakey was born 24 years ago in Paris, France. Ooh. She is the daughter of a Canadian High Commissioner serving in that country. Her father still holds this position. So she's in France. Sorry. So she was born in France because her dad was a High Commissioner for Canada. Although she grew up in France, she would likely have spent most of her life as a deemed resident of Canada because she was there with her father. However, Miss Blakey is now working in London, England. Her only income she earns is from her marketing job, which pays $100,000 annually. Very good job. And is subject to tax in the UK. She's never been to Canada. Determine her residency status. So, if she was still reliant on her father, she's 24. I think deemed dependents can go up to 25, but she is 24. She is an adult. She doesn't even live in France with her father anymore. She did not spend 183 days in Canada because she's never been there. So she's not a sojourner. She's not a soldier. She is the relative of a Canadian officer. And so she does fall into the child of deemed resident. So yes, but she's not dependent. She has her own job and she lives on her own in England, so she would likely not be considered a deemed resident. If she was 16 instead of 24 and still living with her dad, then likely she might have been a deemed resident. 1-11, I think, has to do with dual residency. So we mentioned that we are concerned with residency. But when we're talking about those ties, someone might have a home in two different countries. Maybe my spouse is in Canada, but my children are with me in France. So we have two countries and we have homes in both. So they're both yes. Their second primary tie is in Canada. Our third primary tie is in France. So we have a standoff. We have a tie between these two countries. So what do you do? An individual considered factual or deemed resident of more than one country will look to tax treaties to have a tiebreaker. Where is their residency? This is to provide relief from double taxation. Tax treaties override the Tax Act, so if tiebreaker rules deem an individual not to be a resident of Canada, then they are a non-resident of Canada. Tax treaties override the Tax Act. So the US because US and Canada are so close, this is the one where I think these two countries have the most disputes around residency. US-Canada tax treaty considers the following factors. Where is their permanent home? Where is their center of vital interest, commonly considered their work or method of income? their habitual abode, where do they spend their time, and in what country do they have citizenship. Canada is not concerned with citizenship, but the US is. So citizenship is a factor that they are that because one country is concerned with it, it's within the tiebreaker rules in our tax treaty. If factors don't resolve the question of residency, then we can submit to a competent authority. Basically, you apply to both governments to talk about it. You guys come to a decision on where I am a resident. So these procedures open to aim a dialogue between the two countries. Um, so let's look at that example. So using the tiebreaker rules, we're going to look at two resident status of Dizzy and Donna. Dizzy is a sax player from Los Angeles. He's always lived in the United States. He's not married or living common law, so no spouse to be concerned with. He decides to spend some time in Canada and arrives in Vancouver May 5th, looks for work in various nightclubs. A friend watches his home in Los Angeles while he's gone. He lives in boarding rooms and hotels. So he doesn't have a home in Canada. He has a home in the US, but he's working in Canada. Um, he returns to Los Angeles February 14th. So taking a look there. So the home for case one, there's no permanent home in Canada. It's in the US. He has no family. He travels for work. So there's no center of vital interest. He's somewhat transient in his lifestyle, so he can easily go back and forth. His habitual abode is in Canada because that's where he's been spending most of his nights during the year, but his citizenship is in the US. So because these factors gently lean towards the US, then Dizzy might be considered a US citizen. He is a US citizen sojourning in Canada, so they might give the residency to the US. This citizenship tiebreaker helps put the emphasis that he is still a US resident, so he will only report his Canadian income. The next question is Donna. Donna's a US citizen, lives in New York. In the fall of 2024, while attending a business convention in Toronto, she met Donald, who's a resident of Canada. They decided to get married in 2025. They decided to get married in 2025 and live permanently in the US as soon as Donald could arrange his business affairs. So Donald hasn't moved yet. In December 2024, Donna started working from home and gave notice to her landlord so she could move to Canada temporarily. In January of 2025, Donna and Donald moved in together, sharing an apartment in Toronto, which was leased on a monthly basis while Donald finalized his affairs. In August of 2025, they terminated the lease, returned to New York, where they were married. So, where's Donna's residency? Now, habitually, she was living with her boyfriend in Toronto for more than half the year. So she is her habitual abode is in Canada. Her boyfriend's not common law. Or yeah, her boyfriend's not common law. They're not married. So their relationship doesn't have the status of being a spouse. So it doesn't really count towards the vital interest. And she works in the States. She's only sort of staying in Canada waiting until her boyfriend can sever his ties and make the move. So the fact that she's been in Canada for so long isn't so much of a strength because the relationship status doesn't constitute a spouse. If they got married and were living together in Canada, well, now we have another primary tie to Canada, and that might pull the residency our side. So that is what we look at. That's what the tax treaties considering when they're looking at these things. So, residency of individuals. Are they factual or deemed resident of Canada? Are they a resident of another country? If they're residents of two countries, does Canada have a tax treaty with that country? If Canada has a tax treaty, what are the tiebreaker rules? If the tiebreaker rules mean they're a resident of the other country, then they are a non-resident of Canada. So you can only have residency in one country at a time. We're not going to worry about the residents of corporations and trusts, so I'm going to move past that. Okay? So that's our discussion on residency. Thank you for your time. When we come back, I believe we're going to be talking about the source concept of income and trying to calculate those a net income amount, that division B. Okay, thank you for your time. See you in the next video.